very much indeed, and thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you today. For those of you who don't know TASC, we're an independent progressive think tank, and our core focus is on economic equality and democratic accountability. And obviously today I'll be talking mostly about the economic equality side. And it's worth, I think, starting off with just looking at the word equality. I mean, it was, particularly economic equality, is often seen as an ideological point of view. That, you know, if you want a more equal society in the economy, that it's ideological. And I think there certainly is an ethical strain of thought that says, well, you might want a more equal society because you think it's the right thing or the right kind of society. Or if you've experienced discrimination or marginalization, you feel you want to be more equal with others. But in addition to that, there's an expanding focus on this whole idea of equality in an economy. So for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Wilkinson and Pickett's book, The Spirit Level. These are epidemiologists, health professionals looking at long-term statistical trends, and they've shown a strong correlation between income equality or economic equality on the one hand, with health levels, crime levels, education levels across different societies in the Western world. And they've sort of verified their findings by showing the same kind of correlations between US states. And what they basically show is that in more equal societies, on the whole, generally do better, which is, of course, the subtitle of their book. That we find societies where you have a smaller degree of inequality, you have less crime rates, you have better health effects, you have better longevity. So there's a growing data set there that suggests, well, actually, equality is not just reinforced by an ethical point of view, but there's also a lot of scientific evidence in favor of it. And even in the economics profession, we now have a whole series of papers are just being released in relation to economic equality in the global economic system. So there's IMF working papers, among others, looking at the rise of inequality, the gap between rich and poor that occurred in the last 20 years. And what we see is there was a similar pattern of a rise in inequality in the 1920s, before the Great Depression and, of course, the Wall Street crash. And we've seen a similar rise in inequality from the 1980s, from the time of Thatcher and Reagan and neoliberal economics and deregulation and light touch regulation. So we've seen a similar effect in terms of the distribution of income. And so there's an argument from the point of view of stable economics and having avoiding the boom and bust and having a more even keel, again, for a more equal society. So that's sort of the basis for talking about economic equality. Of course, what do we mean by equality? Is it the same that we want everybody to have the same? Is it that we want everyone to have at least the same minimum decent standard, and after that it is a level playing field and we take it from there? Or are we looking at, you know, equality of opportunity, which is often how equality is talked about in politics, which is very different, of course, from equality of outcome. We want everyone to achieve the same levels of education, health, and so on. In TASC, when we're looking at the issue of economic equality, obviously that involves people's income, but also their assets. So their wealth, which they might have in the form of cash, shares, they might own land or property, a house, including the family home. That's a form of asset or wealth. Perhaps a controversial point, but also things like access to services. If somebody has a medical card, somebody has a lower rent because they're in social housing, that compensates for their income level. At the same time, if somebody has an ability to buy in bulk or to buy things cheaper because they have access to other supermarkets, so for example in rural areas, often people have less choice. They just have one supermarket they can get to. So their cost of living is going to be higher, and usually they'll have higher petrol costs and other costs than people in urban areas who can benefit from more choice and lower prices. So these are kind of complex economic factors that also come into play when we're talking about economic equality. So what do we know? Well, I wanted to show you a few examples of the kind of information we have got. Now, I'm not sure how easily you can see that behind me. Don't know if I can make that any bigger. Okay, this is something called the heat chart, which TASC did a few years ago. Now the data that it's based on is old at this point. I think it's 2006 or 7. And it's based on this EU SILC data. That's the survey of income and living conditions. It's a household survey, and it's done every year. It's done by the CSO in Ireland, but it's done the same way across the EU, so we can begin to compare income levels to a certain extent across Europe. And one of the things with income, what we've done in this chart is we've combined, and it's hard to see here, but to give you a sense, we've colour-coded so that people in red, for example, are those who are retired. People in the light blue are professionals. And although you can't see it on the screen, we've got men, women, and we've got couples with children. And those are the units we're using there. And each little block stands for 2,800 households. So we're trying to depict, if you like, where things are at. And one of the things with the distribution of income is most people feel that they are lower down than they really are. So if we're talking about income, most people think that, well, high income is somebody who has 20,000 more than they do, or more. But this value here is a net household income, gross household income of 40,000 euro. So as you can see, the vast majority of people, about 60% anyway, have a household income of less than 40,000. This is the 60,000 point, the household income, the couple each bringing in 30,000. Again, vast swathe of Irish society. People who are retired, mostly on the social welfare, pensions, people who are unemployed, likewise reliant on social welfare. They're down here with an income, if it's a single person, of about 10,000. So that is the distribution of income in Ireland. So somebody who's on a situation of, say, 80,000 for a household income, or 110,000 is the cut-off point at which you're in the top 10%. So if you had a couple, each of whom is earning 55,000, bring that together, 110,000, they're in the top 10%. They're the high income people. Surprised? Again, on the whole, it is surprising that the vast bulk of people are in this income zone. So the detail matters. The detail of a social welfare payment being cut or something being changed by €5 a week, it all adds up, and it makes a big difference in terms of people's living standards, because it changes their position in the broad distribution of where most people are at. So, on the whole, what do we know? I mean, we have a problem in the sense that we don't have enough data on income and wealth. And I'm not going to bamboozle you today with lots of sort of charts and facts and figures on wealth and income. For a start, we know very little about wealth in Ireland. Recently, the European Central Bank completed a survey on wealth for the Eurozone, but they didn't include Ireland or Estonia. Lack of data. Didn't have enough data to talk about wealth in Ireland. On the whole, looking at the Eurozone, about 85% of wealth is in the form of sort of real assets, and of those, about 60% of overall is houses. People's family home is the big wealth item. Other than that, if somebody owns their business, they might own a shop, they might own a work premises, they might have a second home or multiple homes, they might be a landlord. Those are real assets, physical, tangible things. About 15% of wealth across the Eurozone is financial assets. Things like stocks, shares, bonds, and so on. So the big bulk of wealth is, of course, housing. That's where wealth is at. But we don't know enough about how it's distributed in Ireland, and we certainly don't know about at the very higher echelons of income and wealth, because things like the SILC survey, they're great because they bring in households who agree to do the survey, but you always have sampling problem. Again, putting on my social scientist hat, you always have a problem sampling middle-class men because they're too busy. They won't take part. They won't fill out the forms. Or then you have a problem with people who are self-employed. If anyone is fiddling their tax, of course, they're not going to put it in on the survey form. So you always have a difficulty with survey evidence. And while it's the best thing we've got, and it's a very rich and very useful data set, and then social scientists can get what they're called microsets, and they can look at individual line entries, and they can really see how households are living in terms of their professions, their incomes, the number of children, and so on. At the same time, there are some fundamental limits in what we do know about income. And on the whole in Ireland, we're under-researched. We have a lack of data, and we have a lack of fine-grained data, and we have a lack of people doing research into this kind of data. So that's my complaint for the day. There's just a lack of numbers to play with. But without getting too much into that, and I don't think I have time, I have some other examples of numbers, but I won't go into those on the screen. But there's obviously issues. There's the issue of the black economy. How do you estimate the size of the black economy? It could be as big as 20% in Portugal. In Ireland, we just don't know. I mean, I don't think we have a good estimate. But obviously that affects the distribution of income. It's one of those factors which underlies some of the government decisions, because they're making estimates about to what extent people are cheating. And this is very untransparent, and I think very unjust. So some of the situation with lone parents is there is an assumption that some lone parents are cheating because they formed a new relationship, they're now a couple, but they're claiming lone parent allowance. And if this is the assumption, it should be put out there, it should be made transparent, it should be tested, and the evidence should be brought to bear. But the idea that that's an assumption being made inside government buildings, but it's not being revealed, or it's not being backed up by evidence, is, I would say, unjust and arguably an ideological bias in the whole system. There's other issues in relation to the data. One of the things is that there are sometimes assumptions about what the tax and welfare system does. And there are models of what people are earning, what kind of position they're in, therefore what welfare they're entitled to. So that you can do these nice models. You can say, well, somebody is working at this level, they've got this level of income, they're entitled to child benefit, that brings them up a bit, and they're entitled to family income support, and that brings them up. And so there's calculations of, people's quality of life on the basis of their income, but they're being made on the basis of, if you like, a very simple assumption, a simple model. A family of 2 people with 2 children on this income getting these welfare payments. And that sounds, fair enough. But the reality of the welfare system is, it doesn't work the way it's meant to work in theory. Only 1/3 of the people who are entitled to the family income supplement actually claim it. Those are people who are in low-paid employment, who are entitled to take up this extra welfare payment to boost their income. Is not claimed, because it's a means-tested thing. It's technical. You've got to go in and apply for it, and they've just been very unsuccessful at rolling this out. Now that means that there's an assumption in the calculations that this welfare payment is available to people, and yet people are not claiming it. So there's a dysfunction sometimes in the welfare system itself. I could go on about this for a long time in terms of the technical stuff, but I don't think that's the most interesting thing for today. Where is Ireland in terms of distribution of income? We're about the middle. There are different ways of measuring distribution of income. There's the Gini coefficient. There's the gap between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. That's sort of the quintile ratio, or the 80-20 ratio. And Ireland is about the middle. We're about the middle for the European Union. We're a bit disappointing if you compare us with the rest of Western Europe, that we've been sort of a democratic independent state for 90 years or so, or nearly 100 years now, and yet we're more unequal than most other countries in Western Europe. And that's explained for a number of reasons, not least the late development of the Irish economy, but nonetheless we've come out of the boom and we've become more unequal rather than less as a result. In terms of equality budgeting, in terms of the focus on the budget, and I'll just show you one document here, if I can. Again, it's the kind of thing we have after the budget, sort of the analysis, and I think it's reflected very much in what you see in the media as well. Bear with me for a sec. This is the actual government's papers. There's a whole bunch of papers produced on budget.gov.ie where you can see all of the different aspects of the budget. And illustrative cases. So example 1, Liam is single, no children, self-employed, and these kind of illustrative cases are often used to inform the government as to how the basic aspects of the tax system are affecting people. So you can see this is this person before the budget, this person after the budget, and you can see annual loss of €102 or 0.3%. This kind of calculation. But there's only 6 of them. There's only 6 sort of typical families. And while it's a useful analysis, it is very much illustrative. It doesn't make up for the kind of complexity of detail that we know exists in the real world, where people have care responsibilities. They might have responsibility for somebody in the extended family. They might have complicated childcare arrangements. They might have health issues or disabilities. All sorts of issues that require people to have different needs or special needs are not captured by generic, stereotypical sort of analyses. And yet, when the budget is reported in the newspapers and so on, it's very much, how will the budget affect the money in your pocket? This family will lose €100, that family will lose €200. That's the height of the conversation. We don't get into how will it affect society, how will it affect the economy, what are the kind of wider, longer term effects that we're going to see. There is something, what I like to call the cash delusion, that if you have more cash, you'll be okay. So if the budget gives you an extra €200 a year, great. But if they've given you that €200, for example, by reducing tax, but they've cut spending in health so that you can't afford to wait if you need an operation, so you go private and it costs you €500, well, you gain €200 in cash, but you lost €500 because you had to go private for your operation. All those public services, of course, are cash replacement. And we don't have any kind of sophisticated model that allows us to work out what is the income equivalence of having a healthcare system of a certain type or an education system of a certain type. So, and it's just phenomenally difficult to compensate in terms of calculation for these things. But part of the argument of the benefits of, say, the Nordic systems is precisely because they pay phenomenally high rates of tax. The Danish pay the highest tax in the world. People pay a huge amount of social insurance, whereas Ireland has one of the lowest levels of social insurance in Europe. And yet they get back public services, public transport, health system, education system that compensates them for the cash that they don't have. They might have a lot less cash, but they have a higher quality of life through the provision of a whole bunch of public services, which also leads to psychological security. You're not worried about can you afford the next dental bill or can you afford the next health bill because it's covered. Things which are hard to compensate for in terms of your savings are compensated for by a social insurance model or a national health model. Okay. So there's a lot of resources will be required if we want to do very technical analysis of, you know, how fair is the budget, how equal it is, particularly for subgroups of society. It's technically difficult, there's a lack of resources for it, but there's no doubt it can be improved. And one of the first things, of course, that's necessary is a commitment to the whole idea of equality, that it's worth pursuing. It's part of the problem of any analysis that might show this family's gone up 3%, that family's got down 4%. It assumes where we were at was somehow normal or okay. But we know there's a gender pay gap. So, and we know women are therefore at the lower end of the spectrum. So if women at the lower end of the spectrum lost 2%, and people at the higher end of the spectrum lost 3%, is that fair? Well, not necessarily, because women shouldn't have had that pay gap in the first place. So there's a lot of complexity to that, which requires a commitment to equality, which I think why the Scottish example is so interesting, that there's a commitment to doing an equality audit or an equality examination of the budget. The idea that society shouldn't be growing more and more unequal with the generations. I just want to say a few things about where does the assumption about inequality come from? Well, there's a few arguments that I think we have to look at which are embedded in our economic policy, in our economics. One is the idea that you must have growth for distribution. That if you don't have growth, you won't be creating any new resources. The kettle's coming on, it's the time that's new. You know, if we don't have growth, we therefore can't distribute. So there's an idea that we have to focus on the engine of growth. And it's argued that we need a certain amount of inequality in our economic system to incentivize people. We need a meritocratic system, it's argued, that people who are working hard, who are creating businesses, creating jobs, should be paid more, significantly more, to incentivize them. But I think there's a kind of a falseness about that point of view, because we can be forever pursuing growth, pursuing enough growth. When we have a big enough pie, then we'll be able to distribute. then would be able to assure everybody a minimum standard of living, a minimum quality of life. We had an enormous boom. We reduced to 4% unemployment, and yet we still had a large rate of poverty, particularly child poverty in Ireland. And my argument would be, if we don't have a commitment at a high level to saying we want to eliminate poverty, we want to eliminate these forms of inequality, then even at the height of the boom, we're not going to achieve them. So you need to have that focus. What is well, there's a few of the single most powerful factors in terms of all the statistics that will explain why people have a higher income or why they're better off. One is if they're employed. Employment on its own will do more than the welfare system ever will in terms of raising people's incomes. Now we're now looking at a situation of nearly 15% unemployment. We're also looking back at a period of only 4% unemployment, which is practically nothing, because a lot of that's people moving between jobs. But we only had that because of the debt-fueled boom. That wasn't a sustainable level of unemployment. A long-term average for Ireland over 30 years is nearly 11%, 10.8. We're likely to see long-term unemployment in Ireland at a high level, maybe 1 in 10. Currently, what, 3 in 20. Never mind all the people who are emigrating. So there is a question of how are we going to distribute work? How are we going to distribute the opportunities? Because we know that in any economic system there is what they call a natural level of unemployment. All things being equal, you know, the economy will turn and people will go in and out of jobs, and you'll be left over with people who don't make it in, who don't get the jobs. Well, how are we going to distribute work to them? Because we know that work and employment is more powerful in terms of raising people out of poverty than the welfare system has ever managed to be. So there's a major issue there, because it goes against the grain of our whole economic system. I just mentioned two more things, and then I'll stop. One is that obviously we have a situation where there's inequality, that there are repeated privileges, generation after generation, for people who come from a certain area. Middle-class men, on the whole, have a great deal more advantages than anybody else. They would do better. So it is not discrimination to reduce the privileges gained by one group in society in order to create a more equal society and to reduce an inequality. So I think that's an important argument, because it's often said that it's not meritocratic or that it's unfair to, for example, promote women, people from traditionally working class backgrounds, Ireland's new communities, above the block of white middle class men who are there. But I make the point that it's not discrimination to undo an advantage, as long as it's a case that you actually create a level playing field. So it's in that context, I mean, TASC has argued about the need for inequality auditing, which is to say measure where are we at in terms of equality, not just in terms of income and wealth, but also access to opportunities, access to public services, and so on. And then equality proofing with every budget, which in the first instance is going to have to be qualitative. It's going to have to be reactive, in the sense that it'll be very hard to technically nail it all down, that every single tax change, every single tax break, every single item of spending, that would be able to somehow calculate how that will affect each individual in Ireland. That would take a massive research project. So what we have to do instead is have a commitment that if in one budget we skew things one way, that there's a commitment to skew it back the next budget. Of course, that's, to a certain extent, it's a political commitment, which is not non-neutral. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.